This portion of our training will be talking about exemptions. And there's a very good analogy that we all like to make when it comes to exemptions, and particularly exemptions, but it also pertains to tax relief. And that is, and the analogy is that 10 people go into a restaurant and they eat their meal, and before the bill arrives, 2 of the people leave. Okay, so now 8 people have to pay the bill instead of 10. That's in essence what happens with exemptions, because you're exempting certain people, certain properties from the property tax. And what it does is it shifts the tax burden to the 8 people in the restaurant. Rather than 10 paying the bill, now 8 people have to pay the bill. So that's what's happening here with exemptions and tax relief. So you want to be very, very careful with the exemptions. And exemptions are enumerated in the Constitution, except, as Dave said, for the blind exemption, and no one is willing or wanting to challenge that exemption. But every exemption is listed in the Constitution, and there's statutory guidelines for exemptions. Now, part of the problem that we have with exemptions and also tax relief is that every situation is different. There's almost no situations or no applicants for exemptions or tax relief that are exactly the same. So it gets a little tricky, and the law, particularly on exemptions, is not very expansive. In fact, it's minimal. So they present a little bit of a problem for us. What is the most popular exemption? The one that probably most of us in this room have. The residential exemption, that's right. Now, the primary residential exemption, in terms of classes of property, the residential property is about 42% of the total. So the residential exemption is important because 45% of the value of that home is exempted by law. That's a good exemption. We all like that when we get our bill for our property tax on our house. And also exempted is the household furnishings and furniture. And up to 1 acre of land, only 1 acre of land. Most houses are located on probably 1/4 of an acre, but the exemption will cover up to 1 acre. Yes?
You've got one household on there. What happens if there's a mother-in-law house? Is it included as one household?
Is the mother-in-law house separate and apart from the...
Separate structure 30 feet behind the main structure.
And just the mother-in-law lives in the home. That home would get the residential exemption, okay? Now, the only structures that do not receive the residential exemption are transitory property, hotels, motels, rental pools, limited partnerships on a housing project where people are transient. Those structures do not receive the residential exemption. Now, I need to mention on the household, there was a case a few years ago, and it clarified who was entitled to the residential exemption. And the case involved a man who lived and worked in Park City, and his wife and his children lived and worked lived and went to school in Salt Lake City. They have 2 homes. They own both homes. And they said, we want the residential exemption on the 2 homes. And the case was decided, and the decision was 1 residential exemption per household. So in that case, they got 1. They could choose either the Park City home or the Salt Lake City home to receive the residential exemption, but not both. And that's why the household is important. Now, in determining the primary residential exemption, if you go to Rule 52, it lists lots of criteria and factors to consider. I have listed on the slide here the major ones that are considered, and the ones that are most often considered are bolded with an asterisk beside the factor or the criteria. Now let me give you an example of how this might work. You know, a lot of people do banking through the internet, don't they? Would you, as the Board of Equalization or the county assessor, because the county assessor makes this determination, would you be more inclined to give that person the residential exemption if they show you and provide documentation that their bank is just around the corner, or if the bank is in Arizona? If the bank is just down the corner, would you, now this is just one factor, would you be more or less inclined to give them the residential exemption? You'd probably be more inclined to give them that exemption. However, I would not hang my decision on one criteria. I would look at several different criteria. And we won't go into all the criteria because we don't have time, but as I said, the ones that are highlighted are bolded with asterisks behind them are the ones that are most commonly used in determining that exemption. Now, effective January of this year, there was legislation passed that provided for a part-year residential exemption. Now, this has caused some consternation, let's say, with some county assessors, because the exemption works this way. If the home is occupied 6 months plus 1 day, then the owner can claim a primary residential exemption for the entire year. Okay? Now, before this legislation passed, the owner had to be the recorded owner of that home on January 1, the lien date. This legislation does completely away with that principle. Now, if they buy the home, or if the home was secondary and somebody moved into it as a residence, say 1st of June, they could get the residential exemption for the entire year. Okay? There are some other requirements, though. After May 1, and an application has to be filed in this case. We put together an application, and you'll find the application in your manual. It's at the very end of the exemption slides. They would need to complete the application and file it. And they can file it all the way up to November 30th. But if they file after May 1, then the county has the option of charging a $50 processing fee. The county does not have to charge it, but they have the option, because your systems, your computer systems aren't set up to handle this new law that became effective in January. So that's the primary reason that $50 fee is allowed in code. Now, the legislation also provided that counties can adopt an ordinance. And in this ordinance, they can say that if there's an ownership change, we have the right, or we can require an application for the residential exemption. Or if the home was ineligible for the residential exemption last year, but the owner is claiming the exemption this year, the Board of Equalization can also require an application. Or if the Board of Equalization decides that we don't know for sure whether we should allow the exemption, they can request an application, and that's statutory now.
I just have a question. So what if the opposite happens, that it was a primary residence and somebody purchased it and now it's not their primary residence?
Was it a primary residence, January 1?
Yes.
Okay.
So May 15th, they purchased the house and it's not their primary residence, then are they non-primary for the rest of the year, or have they even addressed that issue?
The law was not addressed.
Okay.
The law did not address that issue. So, because the law didn't address the issue, if it was a primary residence as of January 1, you probably need to give it. So what does that do to the lien date now? It makes it kind of superfluous, doesn't it? Are there any questions on this new law?
So you're saying they can go clear till November 30th now
To file the application
for that year,
for that year,
2015?
2000, for every year subsequent to.
Okay, did it used to be that it had to be in line with the BOE application?
Well, normally, most counties would not require an application for the primary residential exemption. The assessor determined whether that property was a primary residence as of January 1, is how it occurred in the past.
Do you know which
Yes.
bill?
I'm sorry.
Do you know which legislation that was on?
Go to your 2015 property tax related legislation and you'll find. No, you have to go to the 2014 because it passed in 2014. Diana, I can call you and tell you what the bill number that was. And then Buff, you had a question.
So what is the July 1st date then, where you have to have moved in, purchased, and claimed primary by July 1st? That's the new lien date, not January 1st?
The lien date is always January 1. Okay. So they'd have to move in before July 1st. They'd have to move in June 30th in order to get this exemption, because it has to be 6 months plus 1 day, or 183 consecutive days.
So what it takes requiring us is, even though the tax roll has to be closed by May 22nd, we have to open it back up again. And
Not the assessor. The assessor has already passed the roll to the auditor. So the Board of Equalization would authorize the exemption, and the auditor, who is clerk of the Board of Equalization, would make that adjustment to the assessment roll. And it's a manual kind of thing, and it's an imposition on the counties. That's why the legislature authorized $50 to cover the administration costs. Okay, are these primary residences? They're cave houses, and they're located outside of Moab, about 30 miles, and they're really neat. They're really neat. The facade, it looks like a house, but what they do is they blast out the rock, and the home is really inside the rock, and then they build the facade on the front to make it look like a home. So you assessors, that might be a little bit of a challenge to assess those residences. Okay, I have some questions. These exemptions are so specific. So what I thought I would do is provide some examples, because I think that might be a better way for us to learn how it works. And I've got like 6 questions. Diana, why don't you read the question and answer it if you can. If you can't, then I'm sure the group can answer it, and then we'll just pass it on down the row, and we'll learn about the residential exemption by some of the questions we have here.
Number 1, a true or false question.
Yes, the true or false question.
A mobile home assessed as personal property may not receive the primary residential exemption.
Is that true or false?
I'm not sure on personal property. Pass.
Okay, anybody?
The question?
She couldn't
My
hear.
assessor could
She
answer that
couldn't
for me.
hear that.
Oh.
We need to repeat the question.
Does the mobile home receive the primary residential exemption, even though it is classified as personal property?
I have a question. If it is been permanently, the wheels are off, does that make a difference?
No. As long as someone is living in that mobile home, whether it be personal property or real property, it's entitled to the residential exemption. Yeah, it's considered domicile. Yes.
Number 2, a condominium used in a rental pool is entitled to the primary residential exemption.
What do you think, Tom?
I'm guessing it has to do with this new law. The part year thing, doesn't
No,
it?
it's transient.
Okay.
It's a condominium,
Okay, that's all I-
so it would not receive the residential exemption. Good.
Number 3, to qualify for the residential exemption, the property need not be owner occupied. That is true. They
That's
can have
right.
a full-time renter.
Exactly.
Clubhouse furniture, fixtures, exercise facilities, pool equipment, and furniture receive their residential exemption.
True or false?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Anyone else?
It's a clubhouse.
It's a clubhouse. So it is transient, isn't it? Doesn't receive the residential exemption. Now, if you have an apartment building, the apartments themselves will receive the residential exemption. But if there's an exercise room or a pool or any amenities, those things do not receive the residential exemption. Okay?
All right. This is my future residence. A nursing home should receive the residential exemption.
How about a nursing home? Does it receive a residential exemption? That's kind of tricky. So I'll help you with that one. Say you have an elderly person who cannot live alone. They need to go into a nursing home facility. So they're responsible for paying the property tax on their home, right? They will get a residential exemption on their home. Now, on the nursing home side, they're living in the nursing home. So the nursing home owner receives the residential exemption on the portion of the facility that person lives in. So, and that's just the way that the residential exemption works. Now, in the nursing home, if you have people going in and out of that nursing home, then no. But if somebody is residing in the nursing home and that's their residence, that portion is entitled to the residential exemption.
So in essence, that elderly individual is getting two.
No. They're getting the residential exemption on their home. The nursing home owner is getting the residential exemption for that particular part. It's the what?
Still a for-profit business.
Well,
I
we're,
just clarify.
no, this is the way the court has ruled. Yes.
What if somebody goes into a nursing home and they sell their primary residence and no longer have anywhere else to live other than the nursing home?
Then they don't get a residential exemption if they've sold the home. They have to,
So the nursing home owner.
But the nursing home, yes, the nursing home owner gets the exemption on the portion of the nursing home that is a primary residence for an individual.
With that, so if you have a nursing home and say you have 100 rooms in that nursing home, 50 of them are full-time residents, but the other 50 are coming and going or only staying for a month. So the assessor would apportion 50% of that as a residential exemption and 50% as not.
Exactly, yes.
And how's that determined? Is it the 6-month whole thing, or is it, I mean, how do you determine what is?
You know, that is an excellent question. With this new law and the part-year residential exemption, nobody has asked that question. So, you know, we'll just have to wait and see if somebody files an appeal on that. But that could be an issue for appeal. Good thinking. Okay, there are 3 basic types of exemptions. There's property type, there's the ownership type, and the use type. Property type, places of burial are exempt. And farm equipment and livestock are exempt, but only the production part, not the processing end. So, and that can get a squirrely too. And we get appeals on that. Tax Commission gets appeals on that periodically. Inventory is exempt. So if you own a business and you have inventory, that's exempt. Water and power kinds of things are exempt. Intangible property, what do we mean by intangible property? Exactly. Cash, bonds, stocks. Those are,
Looks
yeah, Dave's good looks, yeah.
very intangible.
Okay, on tangible personal property, there's an exemption for a business with a total aggregate value of $10,200. Now that's per county. Let me give you an example. Zions Bank has offices all over the state, don't they? Okay, that's why the limit is per county. So it's $10,200 per county on the personal property exemption. Okay, registered vehicles have an exemption, but what do they pay? They pay a uniform fee in lieu of taxes, age-based fee, or a set fee for a boat or a yacht, mobile home. Those kinds of things are not, they're uniform fees. Okay, now we're going to have to hurry along, but there's, I have a couple of questions, actually I have a lot of questions on property type. Let's just do maybe the first 3 because we really need to hustle.
True or false, a crop duster airplane is exempt.
What do you think? No, it's not. It's not used for production. It's a supportive service. That's why on some of this farm equipment, we have problems. It's a supportive service. It's not actually used in the production of a commodity, agricultural commodity. Okay, next one, Marilyn.
Machinery and equipment used by a person contracting services to a commercial farm operation is taxable. Say yes? And you can tell that.
Good. It is taxable, yes, because it's used in the production of agricultural products.
Household furnishings in a rented pool unit are exempt.
It's transitory, so it's not exempt.
So you
Okay.
need to tax them on the furnishings as well?
In a rental pool,
Yeah.
rental pool are not exempt from property tax because they're transitory, only residential.
But the household furnishings, isn't that what the question was?
Yes, and household furnishings are not exempt under
So they should
rentable.
be
They are taxed.
taxed like personal for personal property?
Yes. Okay, one more, Craig.
Vehicles and personal property owned by Utah members of armed forces stationed under military orders in Utah are exempt from property tax.
What do you think?
It's only with an armed service, so it could go either way based on legislation.
No. If they're in Utah, their residence is in Utah, and they're in the armed services, they are not exempt. Now, somebody coming outside of the state, a non-Utah member of the armed services, is exempt, but not a Utah resident. Resident, I should say. Thank you. Let's just go on to ownership. Now, when we talk about ownership, we're talking about federal government, we're talking about local government and state government. And under the ownership exemption, they do not have to meet the use requirement. If it's federal government, if the federal government owns it, it's exempt. Now, this gets tricky, and I'm not going to go into specifics because we don't have time. If you're interested, go to the exemption standard of practice, and we list some of the federal agencies. Let me give you an example. FHA, home mortgage loan, make home mortgage loans. Okay, the property that FHA owns and conducts their business out of is exempt. But if they sell a home under foreclosure and the home is sold, then or homes that are not sold that are in foreclosure are taxable. So just because it's associated with a federal government organization or such, it doesn't necessarily mean it's exempt, and it gets very tricky. So when you're dealing with the federal government, you need to read, get into federal statutes and look to see whether it's ownership and how they're taxed, because it's different. Now, we get a lot of questions on the American Red Cross. People don't think they should be exempt, but if you check the federal statutes, you learn that the American Red Cross was created by Congress, and they are an instrumentality of the federal government. So that's a little case where, you know, we need to be, you need to always check the federal statutes. Okay, I have.
Case in our county where a post office is actually in a person's like place, you know what I mean, it's not owned by the US government. So it is still taxed.
Yes.
Because it's owned by a person.
That's
They do
right.
business out of that.
Yes. Yeah, the property is being rented to the U.S. Postal Service. So the property is taxable. Okay, let's just,
Asterisk about the Native American property.
yes.
What were you about to say about that didn't?
On Native American property, if a registered member of the tribe owns property on the reservation, that property is exempt. But if a Native American who is not a member of that tribe on the reservation, they are not exempt. So in order to be exempt on a reservation, they need to be a registered member of the tribe.
What about a residential home owned by the tribe, not at the reservation?
Nope. No, it has to be on the reservation. Okay. Let's just do maybe 1, 4, and 5. Well, let's do 1, 5, 6, and 7 because we've already covered the Native Americans.
Lands granted by Congress to a railroad corporation are exempt from property tax.
Is that true? No, a railroad corporation. No, they're taxed. Centrally assessed.
The government gave them the land and it's theirs.
Okay.
Federal land subject to an agricultural lease is exempt.
That true or false? It is true. They are exempt. Good, Pat. Let's skip the Native American questions because we've covered that, I think.
Recreational cabin located on federal/state land is exempt.
Okay, is the land exempt? Yes, but not the cabin. Okay, good.
American Red Cross owns a rental property used as a primary residence and rented at a market rate. Since the rental income is used to support Red Cross programs, the property is exempt.
What do you think?
That'd be like the same as the post office, or building would not be.
That's right. That's correct. Good. One more.
That's it.
Okay. Okay, ownership of state government. Now, on these ownership exemption, government exemptions, there's a tax called the privilege tax. And the privilege tax is if the government owns a property and they lease it out to a private business to run a for-profit business, then the tax is going to be called the privilege tax. Now, the privilege tax is no different than the property tax in terms of the amount paid. The difference is on you, because it's government property, you can't lien it. You cannot do a lien on government property. So what happens if a business is doing business on government land and fails to pay their property tax? How are you going to collect that property tax? Don't have a lien.
Personal property?
Well, it could be personal property or real property.
Personal property, can you seize?
Yes. If it's real property, what do you do? What you do is you go to the clerk, you get them to file a judgment in court. So that's the way you're going to collect on the privilege tax, through a judgment.
Maryland has a question.
Maryland.
I just wanna know if the state really owns an airplane.
Yes, they do own an airplane. That the governor flies around in. Yes, ma'am. King Air. I used to fly in that airplane when I worked in the governor's office. It's a wonderful airplane.
Bounces you around pretty good under any turbulence, so yeah.
Now, I'm going to tell you about another specific kind of situation. And it's an exemption to the privilege tax. You see how complicated property tax can sometimes be? Where there's a rule, there's an exception. Okay, on the privilege tax, and let's take the tax commission building for an example. You're all familiar with the tax commission building. It's a government building, it's exempt. On the ground floor of that tax commission is a little cafe, a little eating place. It's not a cafe, but you can get sandwiches and food there. It's for profit. They make money on it. Okay, is that to be taxed or not? No. And the reason is because of the exemption to the privilege tax. If there is a concession at an airport, a park, or a public, place, then they can be exempt. And that property is available for general public use. It's exempt from the privilege tax. Now, let me give you another example.
But then what about the personal property inside?
Yes,
The personal property is exempt?
yes.
What if isn't the owner of the cafe blind?
He happens to, makes no difference. Makes no difference. Let's,
The airport
He is. Let's take another example. Let's take the Salt Lake City International Airport. You've all been there. You've all seen those places of business at the airport. They're all exempt from property tax because they're doing business on government property, but they're open for their concession. If they're a concession, they're open to the general public. They are exempt from property tax. Okay. Okay, now, okay, let's talk about local government for a minute. And we have to hustle along here because we're getting a little short on time. But a lot of people ask questions about the charter schools. Charter schools, in terms of the statutory law, are exempt from property tax because they're considered educational. Now, they do not levy a property tax. They get their money through a school district and the State Board of Education. There will be a bill in the legislature this upcoming year to allow charter schools to levy a property tax. They have been working on that bill for a couple of years, and it looks like it'll probably hit the legislature this year. So charter schools will be able to levy a property tax.
So they'll be their own school district? How will that work?
Well, we'll have to wait and see, won't we? That might be a surprise. Okay, I have some questions on the ownership exemption, and we'll take specific cases and maybe learn a little more. Okay, go ahead.
A house owned by a public high school as a result of construction by students in an industrial arts class is exempt.
What do you think, Bob? She's right. Good.
After the home is sold, it is still exempt. No.
Okay. All right, good.
Okay, so what about that new lawn? Is it exempt for the whole year?
Depends. Is it occupied by a resident for 6 months and 1 day?
So if they move in July 2nd, they're exempt for the whole year, right?
July 2nd? No. No, they have to move in June 30th, at least by June
No, what I'm
30th.
saying is it's exempt, and they're not going to be in it for 183 days.
Okay.
Does it stay exempt?
Okay. Let me think about that one.
It was exempt on January 1st, so it's
It,
exempt for a full year.
no, it's not, because ownership is allowed a proportional exemption, which means that, you know, as long as the government owns it, there's no tax on it. But if they sell it, then they have to pay the tax, you know, the date that they acquired it to the end of the year. There's proportional tax on the ownership exemption and the religious, charitable, and educational exemption. That's a little tricky. Okay.
Property acquired and titled in the Utah Transit Authority's name is exempt from property tax.
What do you think?
Does it fall under the special district property?
True. True. Utah Transit Authority is a special district. That's so it's local government, so it's exempt. Okay.
The city acquires a property on July 1st. Property taxes for the current year are $1,000. How much property tax does the city pay? July 1st, I'd say $1,000.
No,
City doesn't pay.
no, no.
The person will pay.
City doesn't pay anything for the rest of the year because it's a government-owned property, but they would have to pay for the first 6 months. And they'd have to, well, in the closing, they'd have to get that money from the prior owner because it's taxable. That's a proportional tax, remember. So the first 6 months would be taxable.
A school district buys land to build a school in the future. Is the vacant land exempt? No.
It is exempt.
Really?
It is exempt. This confuses people. And the reason it confuses people is if it's ownership, they own the land, it's vacant. As long as it's vacant, it gets the exemption. But if they have a farmer come in and farm that, then it's subject to the privilege tax because it's being used for profit. But as long as that land is vacant and the ownership is government, it's exempt. Now that's not true for the religious, charitable, educational exemption. On that exemption, they have to go through a use requirement. So if the land's vacant, they're not using that land for religious, charitable, or educational purposes, are they? So that vacant land would be taxable for the religious, educational, and charitable exemption. You see, that's why these exemptions get confusing. There are different types of exemptions. There are different rules for these types of exemptions. And so it is confusing for people. But are there any, do you have any more questions on that? Vacant land is tricky. Okay.
A training facility located in Park City trains U.S. Olympic athletes. Is the training facility exempt? No.
Nancy knows.
Well, it depends on the year. I'm laughing because it went this way, then it went that way, then it went this way, then it went that way.
But now it's settled down because Senator Kurt Bramble sponsored legislation 2 years ago to allow the exemption on Olympic training facilities for Olympic athletes. And that's the reason it's in the statute.
But who owns this land? Is it a private owner or is it state?
A private owner could own the land, and as long as it's an Olympic training facility, it's exempt per statute.
So would that exempt snowbird?
Well, I don't know. We'd have to do some research on that. This is another thing which makes exemptions difficult. You need to do your research. You need to get all the facts. And once you get the facts, then, you know, it's a judgment call by the Board of Equalization in many cases.
As far as I'm aware in our county, the Park City Ski Resort, those resorts are still taxed.
Yeah.
Even though
I
don't
think
ski
they,
on them,
yeah,
it's the Olympic Park that is not.
that's right.
It's their use, the general
Yeah, the
use of
use.
property is,
Yeah.
yes, is for the public.
Do you have to receive a designation from the USOC to be an Olympic training facility?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so
That would be a criteria you'd want to look at. Yeah. Okay, now the religious, educational, charitable exemption, AKA the exclusive use exemption. And there are two key terms here you need to pay attention to. The first is, actually there's a two-pronged test. It has to be a 501(c) organization. And it has to be exclusively, and that term exclusively is key. Has to be used exclusively for religious, educational, and charitable purposes. Now, religious purposes, you know, the Constitution and the statutes really do not define this. I could put together a religious organization and probably get the exemption. It's that loose. Educational is the same thing. If you are providing the same kinds of services as the college or a university or a public school, you'll get that exemption.
So why couldn't you get the educational if you were home taught? Homeschool.
That depends. You might be able to. You would have to put together an application and detail for the Board of Equalization what exactly you're doing, what rooms in your house you're using, how much time you're spending on it, and the curriculum.
And wouldn't you have to be a 501(c)(3)?
And you've got to be a 501(c)(3) organization in order to be there. Okay, I'm going to skip that because that gets a little confusing. On the exclusive use exemption application, there are specific criteria that you have to provide the Board of Equalization, because it is the Board of Equalization that makes the determination as to whether you get the exemption or not. You file your application with the county auditor. So the auditor collects those applications, submits them to the Board of Equalization, and they make a judgment or determination based on various factors. Now, this is the exemption that requires an annual application. Every year they have to apply for this exemption. The residential one, no, and the ownership one, no. But this one, yes. Every single year they have to apply.
But is it true that some churches do not?
In most cases, at least in Salt Lake County, I know that the predominant religion, the LDS religion, prepares a list of all the church buildings
So it's still done.
and provides it to the county. Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
I do it in Utah County, and I get a whole book.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you do not get the letter, we have some we get letters from, we send them another postcard saying, hey, we haven't received your letter. Some still did not apply, so they lose that exemption.
Exactly. Right on. That's exactly what the law says. You know, you stop the exemption if they do not apply. They'll only make that mistake once. Okay. This is the one that is a bugger. Ah, this one is really tough. And Diana brought up the classic case for this charitable exemption. Now, it's a long, long story, and it's a fascinating story. And I am going to try and give it to you in just a few minutes. And my information is second or third or fourth hand. So if I miss some dates and different things, you know, help me out, Diana. About IHC began in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, submitting to all of the counties and the Board of Equalizations an application for an exemption based on the charitable exemption. They claimed they were a nonprofit. Well, they all denied it. Okay, so then IHC goes to the legislature, and they convinced, well, the tax commission denied the exemption. It was denied all the way along. Every county assessor, tax commission said, no, you know, we're not going to grant the exemption. So IHC went to a legislator and got the legislator to sponsor legislation allowing a constitutional amendment to exempt, you know, nonprofit hospitals. Well, it passed the legislature, and, you know, a 2/3 vote on both houses of the legislature. So then it goes to it's on the ballot. It's on the general election ballot. And the public turned that provision down by a narrow margin. So IHC lost on that front. You know what they did? 1992, 93, they took the case to the Utah Supreme Court. And we had three very, which we call our heroes. It was Ron Smith, who was the assessor of Utah County, Bob Yates from Salt Lake County, assessor from Salt Lake County, and Kathleen Howe from Cache County. And it goes to the Supreme Court. Well, our heroes lost big time. All 5 Supreme Court justices allowed that exemption. And so as a result of the Supreme Court decision, we now have a nonprofit standard of practice, and it's located in the exemptions, standard of practice at the very end. So that's the story of the infamous story of IHC.
Is that why they have to show a charity plan?
Yes, they're not exempt from applying every year. They have to apply every year. And they'll figure a way to, so that the exemption cannot be denied. We've discovered that over and over again.
They have good legal counsel.
They have excellent legal counsel.
Yes.
And they own the legislature too, so they're in good shape.
So does every county have IHC facilities in it?
I don't know. I know that Salt Lake has
Just wondering
a
how
lot.
widespread the problem is, you know, and if I can just get-
Diana, tell us how much money is lost through that exemption.
I
This
don't
is Cache
know-
County.
I don't have my calculator with me, but I know that the IHC exemption, Kathleen and I worked through it, and it's about over 2.5% of our tax base. So we're looking at what, almost $2 million?
That's-
And they were the ones, I mean, they only wanna fill out PT 21, which is the continued application, even though the rules and such say that we can ask them for their financials. Because, I mean, if they've had an exemption since 1983, I mean, corporations change, their financials change, their structure changes, they build new stuff. Anyhow, they were the ones that like held out on me till the very last dying minute on any financials. They didn't wanna give us any.
Yeah.
Of course, they're nonprofit. They just wanted to
Well-
accept that charity plan where they inserted the figures at face value.
Yeah.
Does
So-
that mean anyone can go to IHC and be serviced there and just not pay a bill? Because it's charitable?
There's actually, there is ways, if you go to IHC, there is ways you can pay them, not pay the bill.
But the point here is, Cache County they're exempting $2 million. How much do you think Salt Lake County is exempting with all of the IHC facilities in Salt Lake County and Utah County? So,
And like she says, then that shifts the burden of the taxes to others.
The biggest problem is that there are entities that compete with IHC that are taxable.
yeah.
And to me, as a guy who believes in the free market, that's the crux of what I consider to be the shame, is that you are creating an uneven playing field between healthcare providers. So anyway,
You know,
but it is what it is.
Yeah.
Dave's opinion versus the Utah
Okay.
Supreme Court.
this is a good example as to how political property tax can be. I can give you example after example after example. We don't have time, but this is a good one of how political property tax can be. But these are the factors that are considered when the Board of Equalization is looking at a charitable exemption. Why is that? Okay. Now, will all of you please say with me what's on the screen at the count of 3? 1, 2, 3. Utah Supreme Court says, when in doubt, tax. And the reason for that is make those people applying for the exemption defend their exemption. You know, you don't have anything to lose, but it's a good way to proceed. If there's any doubt at all, tax them. I had questions on this exemption, but we just really don't have time to go through them. Okay, 3 points we need to make here. The exemption is determined by the Board of Equalization, and every year they need to file an application, an annual application by March the 1st. If they don't file that application, then you have the right to deny the exemption. Just deny it. They'll not make that mistake again. If they're denied, they can appeal to the State Tax Commission, and again, it's that proportional tax that we talked about earlier. Okay, you be the judge, and my time is really going fast. But does anybody recognize this sculpture? If you do, raise your hand. Okay, Commissioner Smith. It's the thinker. Do you know who the artist is, the sculptor? Rodin, Auguste Rodin, a Frenchman. Okay, everybody put on their thinking cap. We'll do maybe one or two cases here. This is the case of the government property sold in July. The government owned land with a home prior to the lien date, and the government sells the property July 1 after the lien date and after the assessment roll date. How much tax should be charged? Half, right. Good, you're all thinking well. This is the case of the religious cafe. A 501(c) religious group owns a coffee shop, and they sell goods at market rates. The indigent get cheap or free food, and any profits go to the religious organization. Now remember, this is not a church, it's a coffee shop. Should they be exempt or taxable? Pat?
Not under the religious exemption, they shouldn't, but could they qualify for the charitable?
No, it's the use of the property that is important here. What's the use of the property? It's a coffee shop. They're selling goods. It's a for-profit business. They are not exempt.
Isn't the term market rates kind of in there? If they were selling it, it's just not to make a profit. Just
No, doesn't matter.
Good.
Doesn't matter if it's market rates or
If they were selling it at just the cost, you're not at market rate. You're not
Well,
profiting anymore. You're not a profitable
okay,
business.
that's a judgment call, and you'd have to make that argument to the Board of Equalization to see if they'll grant the exemption or not. The criteria is use. It has to be exclusively used for religious, charitable, educational exemptions.
So you're not making any money, but you're paying the people to run it?
What's the use? What's the use of the property?
But what if you weren't making any money? But you have to pay the people to run it?
Again, that's going to be a decision. It's a judgment call, and it makes exemptions difficult. It's the Board of Equalization. I would submit that to the Board of Equalization, let them get more of the facts, get all the facts to make a decision or a judgment call.
And when in doubt, tax.
And when in doubt, what do you do? Tax.
Let there be a decision by the BOE.
Yeah, let them defend their
Make
exemption.
them appeal.
Yeah. Okay. You know, I'm running into Josh's time, so I'm going to just flip through some of these. Okay, now we've talked about exemptions, and the exemptions we've talked about are government exemptions, the residential exemptions. We've talked about religious, charitable, educational exemptions. There are other exemptions that pertain to individuals, such as the Veterans with a Disability exemption, the Active Duty Armed Forces exemption, and the blind exemption. And this is going to lead us into tax relief because we consider those three exemptions tax relief. So Josh is going to cover for us tax relief. You get a break from me. You've listened to me for a long time, and I appreciate your attention and your participation. Thank you.